All right, welcome to this explainer. Right now, the global geopolitical landscape is moving at absolute breakneck speed, and the reporting around a potential end to the US-Iran conflict is, well, frankly, it's chaotic. One minute we hear peace is imminent, and the very next we're seeing active military engagements. So today, we're going to cut right through the noise. We are using only the direct statements from the primary players to map out exactly what is going on with this proposed US-Iran peace deal.
To really grasp the massive gap in the narratives here, we've got to look at how this potential deal is actually being communicated. Take President Donald Trump, for instance. He released a highly specific, super optimistic social media post, essentially declaring that an agreement is done. He painted this very vivid picture of the endgame, saying, at the appropriate time when all is calm, we will go in and get the nuclear dust buried deep under the powerful sunken granite mountains, thanks to our beautiful B-2 bombers and their brilliant pilots, and downblend and destroy it, whether in Iran or the United States. He laid out a timeline where a signing would happen immediately with absolutely zero money exchanging hands.
But the second you look across the negotiating table, the story completely flips. In stark contrast to the U.S. administration claiming an immediate signing is happening, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi threw some serious cold water on that rapid timeline. While he did acknowledge that the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding has never been closer, he explicitly warned that pending its finalization, the media should refrain from entering speculation about its content. So, Iranian authorities are making it crystal clear that the text is not finalized and the signing is definitely not guaranteed for the quick timeline the U.S. is pushing. Okay. Let's dive into this. To make sense of these totally mixed signals, here's our agenda. We're going to cover 1. A looming interim agreement. 2. Conflicting timelines and terms. 3. Inside the proposed framework. 4. Regional risks and Israel. And finally, 5. The global diplomatic fallout.
Starting right off with Section 1, a looming interim agreement. The friction on the ground right now is it's truly unbelievable. Just look at this 48-hour window. A mere 48 hours prior to these supposed diplomatic breakthroughs, the U.S. was actively bombing Iran, with the president threatening even more powerful strikes. Fast forward to the present day, and the U.S. military is out there downing multiple Iranian attack drones right near the Straits of Hormuz. And yet, simultaneously, while missiles and drones are literally still flying, both sides are declaring that a diplomatic agreement has never been closer. It's a highly fragile environment where you've got active military engagements happening right parallel to peace declarations.
Moving right along to Section 2, conflicting timelines and terms.
Here's the thing, even when both sides actually agree they are close to a deal, they completely disagree on what the deal says. It's a massive discrepancy. On one side, the U.S. administration is heavily pushing a narrative that the deal is scheduled to be signed on Sunday, and they adamantly insist that zero money will exchange hands. On the flip side, Iranian state media is explicitly denying a Sunday signing. Not only that, but they're reporting that the agreement triggers the unfreezing of $24 billion in Iranian assets, and they're demanding half of that money up front the moment the deal is signed.
So, you might be wondering why the intense pressure from the U.S. side to sign specifically on Sunday, while the timeline is hugely significant for the president. Sunday happens to be President Trump's 80th birthday. It's also the exact same day he is hosting roughly 4,000 people on the White House South Lawn to watch UFC fights. On top of that, Monday morning, he departs for the G7 summit in France to meet with Middle Eastern leaders. Having a signed agreement in hand before stepping onto that world stage, especially during a massive celebratory weekend, is clearly a huge priority. This U.S. optimism was even echoed by Pakistani mediators who predicted a 24-hour timeline, though as we've seen, Iran continues to hedge.
Let's move to Section 3, inside the proposed framework.
So, the crucial point is, despite all those massive public disagreements about money and timelines, there actually is a core structure they both seem to acknowledge. But make no mistake, this is not an end to the war. It's really just an agreement to make an agreement. Step 1 is signing the Memorandum of Understanding, which basically acts as a ceasefire. Step 2 requires Iran to open the Strait of Hormuz, while the U.S. lifts its blockade on Iranian ports. Step 3 is the real picker here. This triggers a 60-day period of intense, highly technical negotiations. Only in Step 4 do we theoretically reach a final comprehensive deal, addressing the absolute hardest issue of all, Iran's nuclear capabilities. Now, to really understand what's going to be debated during those 60 days, we need to demystify some of the jargon flying around in these reports. When the president talks about burying and destroying nuclear dust, what he's actually talking about is Iran's highly enriched near-bomb-grade uranium. And it's no secret stash. According to U.S. intelligence, Iran has literally been collapsing tunnels and booby-trapping entrances with mines to protect this material. The U.S. is demanding the extraction and downblending of this material. That just simply means reducing its enrichment levels so it can never be used for nuclear weapons. But Iran, they're saying these nuclear issues are strictly postponed for those 60-day final negotiations.
There's another major hurdle looming for those 60 days, and that involves the Strait of Hormuz. Reopening this incredibly vital waterway is absolutely essential for stabilizing global oil prices and, quite frankly, getting relief to American consumers at the gas pump. The U.S. position is firm. This must be reopened for absolute freedom of navigation for everybody. However, Iran's foreign minister has publicly stated the strait is not going to return to pre-war conditions. What that means is the regime intends to start charging transit service fees to shipping companies just to pass through.
Which brings us to Section 4, Regional Risks and Israel.
Look, this potential agreement absolutely does not exist in a vacuum, and the regional players involved could easily threaten the entire framework. A massive sticking point in the leaked drafts of this memorandum is the demand for a permanent cessation of hostilities on all fronts, and that includes Lebanon. This is incredibly complex. Why? Because Hezbollah, which is a designated terrorist group and a major Iranian proxy, outright refuses to disarm or abide by any U.S.-brokered agreements between the Lebanese and Israeli governments. To put that into perspective, 1% of Israel's entire population is currently displaced from the north because of Hezbollah rocket fire. Israel's security concerns are absolutely paramount here. They are demanding the explicit right to strike back and defend themselves if Hezbollah attacks, which makes this proxy conflict one of the absolute greatest risk points for any lasting U.S.-Iran deal.
Finally, let's look at Section 5, the global diplomatic fallout.
And this brilliantly illustrates a massive point. Win, lose, or draw on this 60-day negotiation, this conflict has already fundamentally altered global relations. The traditional alliances that have held firm for decades are now deeply fractured, and it's forcing major global players to completely pivot their diplomatic strategies.
Let's unpack how this actually builds. A primary piece of the fallout is the deeply damaged relationship between the U.S. and Europe. When the U.S. initially called for NATO involvement in this conflict, European allies felt totally blindsided, and they simply said no. Because of that, the U.S. is now actively signaling that European security is no longer fundamental to U.S. security. Guys, this is a historic shift, dating all the way back to the end of World War II. And you know what? It's not just Europe. U.S. allies in the Gulf are feeling pretty unprotected right now after the U.S. started this conflict without defending the allies who inevitably got dragged into it. So they are taking matters into their own hands. The surprise element here is immense. Countries like the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia are starting to bypass Washington entirely. In fact, reports indicate the UAE has already agreed to provide billions of dollars directly to Iran, just to secure their own separate peace and find a completely new regional accommodation. Meanwhile, while the U.S. is scrambling to manage these fractured alliances, China is stepping out of this crisis looking remarkably strong. They've managed to weather the global oil shortages without relying on massive imports, and they're heavily positioning themselves as a major provider of renewable energy. Furthermore, with so much U.S. military equipment and assets tied up and distracted in the Middle East, China directly benefits from a weakened U.S. presence defending interests over in the Indo-Pacific. For a lot of players on the global stage right now, China is successfully presenting itself as a much more reliable great power in the wake of this war. So what does this all mean? Which brings us to the ultimate question. If this memorandum is actually signed, we enter a 60-day technical negotiation period to solve the absolute most intractable issues. We're talking billions in frozen assets, service fees in the Strait of Hormuz, Hezbollah's weapons in Lebanon, and deep underground nuclear material. With all of that still left on the table to be solved, we have to ask, is this framework actually the end of the war? Or are we merely looking at a 60-day pause before the bombing starts all over again? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Definitely keep your eyes on the news, because the clock on those 60 days may start ticking very, very soon.